So what do you do when somebody who has hurt you now needs you? Let's talk about on this week's episode of Journey at Home. So let me ask you a question. Is it easier to follow Jesus, to trust, to forgive, to be generous, to choose humility? Is it easier to do that in adversity or in success? That can be difficult in both, but in my experience, adversity often humbles us to the point we're willing to admit our need for God. Adversity reminds us that we are out of control, and out of control people are people who are often ready to look for a God they believe is in control, at least until the adversity becomes so painful that they then turn their frustration on God. But when things are going well, we don't feel out of control, do we? We feel in complete control, and we make the mistake that seems to be human nature to make. We assume that our success makes us smarter than everybody else, even God. And when you feel superior to others, when you feel in control of your future, let's be honest, it's hard to be humble enough to follow Jesus, isn't it? But as my mama always told me when I was a kid, pride goes before a fall. I have no idea why she felt the need to tell me that so much. But this is the final episode of our series, The Life and Times of Joe Jacobson, and it is an ancient story that is full of extremes. No matter how bad your life becomes, I can promise you Joseph's was worse. And no matter how great your life becomes, I can promise you Joseph's at one point was better. But through it all, Joseph was able to maintain this trust and this confidence in God, which is why we've been asking the question, what would somebody like you do who was confident God was with them? What would somebody in your current circumstances do if they had no doubt that God was by their side? What would somebody with the opportunity that's in front of you right now, what would they do if they were confident God was going to take care of them? What would someone with your success, what would somebody with your resources, what would somebody with your power do if they were confident that God was with them? It was not easy for Joseph to remain confident God was with him. As you may remember his story, at 17 years old, his brothers fake his death. They sell him into slavery. He ends up the slave of a powerful Egyptian captain named Potiphar. And then Potiphar's wife notices Joseph, tries repeatedly to sleep with him. When Joseph refuses, she gets so mad, she eventually falsely accuses him of rape. He's thrown in the Egyptian dungeon. And Joseph sits in a prison until he is 30 years old. But that is when he gets this extraordinary, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to interpret a dream for Pharaoh. Which, let's be honest, this is like his get-out-of-jail-free card, isn't it? So Joseph tells Pharaoh that God's warning him of what's to come. There are going to be 7 years of abundant crops in Egypt. They're going to be followed by 7 years of severe famine. And then Joseph gives Pharaoh a plan to prepare for what's coming. And the plan's so wise, Pharaoh does the unthinkable. Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. So Joseph goes from a prisoner to a prime minister in a day. It is unbelievable. And everything Joseph says about, what's going to happen, it all comes true. There's 7 years of abundance where Joseph saves up grain throughout Egypt, and then a famine hits that is so severe the entire region's decimated. In Egypt, because of Joseph's wisdom, Egypt is now the only place in the region with any food. So after about 2 years of famine, the writer of Genesis tells us about this twist in the story that nobody saw coming. He says when Jacob, now that's Joseph's dad who's still living back in Israel and thinks Joseph's dead, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he looked at his sons and he said, why do you just keep looking at each other? You wanted to say this to people before, haven't you? It's like, what are you doing? Why you keep sitting here? We need to do something, right? Well, that's the mentality he had. And then Jacob says to him, all right, I've heard there's grain in Egypt, so I want you sons to go down there. I want you to buy some for us so we'll live and not die. And the story tells us that 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. And then it tells us this. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. This is a pretty dramatic moment. Joseph at this point, he's about 40 years old. And they have not seen their brother since he was 17. And they have no idea he is the reason that Egypt has all this grain that they need. And Joseph has no idea that in spite of everything he's been through, his greatest test in trusting God is actually about to come not in the most painful moment of his life, but in the most powerful one. So if you've been tracking with us through this series and you've thought, Listen, nobody can be that good through all this. Well, I'm telling you, Joseph's story is about to become real, because when he has a chance to use his power for payback, he starts to take it. The story tells us, so when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. They didn't know it was Joseph. But as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger. And he spoke harshly to them in Egyptian, so they wouldn't know he was a Hebrew. And he says, "Where do you come from?" And they looked back at him and they said, "Well, from the land of Canaan. We're here to buy food." And the writer tells us that although Joseph recognized his brothers, they still didn't recognize him. Now, what would you have done if you were Joseph? What do you do when you realize you've got the opportunity for a little payback? I mean, after all the pain they inflicted on him, now he's holding all the cards. He's got all the power. He can deny them the food they want. He could take their freedom. He can pay them back for all that pain they caused. Now they have circled back and they need him. Listen, here's something you need to understand. Eventually, the people who hurt you, they will probably need you. Your mom or your dad who created so much pain for you, they're going to circle back and they're going to need you. Your brother, your sister who treated you, like the younger one or the insignificant one, well, they're going to circle back. And they're going to need you because after all, you were smart enough to marry well and they didn't, right? So you're doing well financially and you're doing well in life. Now they need some help or their kids need some help. Or maybe it's the boss who fired you or the coworker who sabotaged you or the friend who betrayed you or that ex who made the divorce so bitter, it's just made your life so difficult. I'm just telling you, eventually, they will probably circle back and need you. And in that moment, you will have a significant decision to make. You're going to have to decide, what am I going to do now that I have all this power? Well, Joseph, he didn't handle it very well at first. When he sees his brothers, he actually accuses them of being spies. And he gets them all thrown in prison for like 3 days. I mean, he scares them to death. This is just me, but I think it was kind of his way of going, "Hey guys, let me introduce you to my friend, the prison warden. I spent a lot of time with him because of you." And then after 3 days, he brings them back out of prison and he says, "Okay, I'll believe you aren't spies if you bring that youngest brother that you mentioned you had, if you bring him back here with you. So one of you's got to stay here with me and I'm going to leave you in prison until the rest of you come back with your younger brother Benjamin." And Simeon, who's one of the older brothers, he says, "All right, it's the best option we got. I'm going to stay." So the rest of the brothers leave. But what they don't know is Joseph took all the money they had given for their grain and he had it put back in their luggage. So after they've traveled a few days, they open up their bags and immediately they're like, "Oh no, we don't know how this happened. God's clearly punishing us for what we did to Joseph years ago. This is payback because here's the money. We don't know how it got here." So they get back to their dad, Jacob. They give him the food. They tell him everything that happened with the money. And then they go, "Hey, we got to take this money back and we got to take Benjamin, our brother, back, or we're never going to see Simeon again." And Jacob, imagine this. Jacob goes, "No way. Benjamin is my favorite son. You're never taking him back." "Well, what about Simeon?" Jacob's kind of like, things happen. It's tough. He just abandons him. But after a while, well, guess what happens? You could predict it. They run out of food again, right? They're on the verge of starvation again. And so finally, they convince Jacob to let them take Benjamin and take double the amount of money that they had found in their bags and go back for more food. And when they get to Egypt, they're in for a surprise because Joseph has a meal prepared for them and he seats them around the table in their birth order. And they're thinking, how did they know, But they still don't realize it's Joseph. And then after the meal, Joseph sells them some more grain and he gives them Simeon back. But again, he secretly has all the money put back in their bags. Only this time, he also has his personal silver goblet put in Benjamin's bag. And then Joseph lets them get just outside the city walls and he sends the Egyptian police to catch them. And they accuse him of theft and they're all like, no, they swear we didn't steal anything. Matter of fact, one of the brothers says, "You ought to kill the person who has that cup, but it won't be any of us." And then they open up all their bags. Sure enough, there is the cup in Benjamin's bag. So they're terrified. And they're dragged back in front of Joseph again, and they're pleading for their lives. But this time, something, we don't know exactly what, but something changed in Joseph. Something clicked where he finally realized, oh my gosh, I don't think God orchestrated all this so I could get payback on my brothers. And so he decides to take a different route. He looks at him and he tells him, I'm Joseph. And then he asks him the question, was my father still living? But his brothers, the writer tells us they weren't able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. I'm sure they were. So Joseph looks at him and says, no, guys, come on, come close to me. He says, I really am your brother Joseph. I'm the one you sold into Egypt. And you know those brothers were looking at each other like, oh man, yeah, that's Joseph. Man, sorry about that, man. We'd forgotten, what a rotten thing for us to do. We're so sorry. You're looking good though, They knew and they assumed, these brothers did, that all of this was God's way of paying them back. But here's the difference. In this moment, Joseph realized God hadn't actually given him power to pay them back. He had given him power for a greater purpose. And so listen to this. He looks at his brothers, he says, no. Do not be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. In other words, there's a purpose to this, to which we would go, no, God didn't send you, Joseph. That was your brother's fault. But you see, Joseph saw God's hand in everything that happened. Joseph finally had enough perspective as time had passed to realize, you know what? God had been silent through those 13 tough years, but he had not been absent. God had put Joseph exactly where Joseph was so he could save his family and a whole lot of other people from starvation. And so Joseph does the unthinkable. He forgives them. And he sends them back and says, I want you to go get my father. I want you to get the rest of my family and come back here to Egypt. I'm going to give you land where you can live. I'm going to give you food and feed you through this entire famine. I'm telling you, Joseph's forgiveness and his generosity are unexplainable, except that's actually what somebody would do who was confident God was with them through all the pain. So listen, when you recognize that your pain and your power both have a purpose, when you realize the sins others commit against you can't derail God's purpose for you, well, you're going to be willing to do what anybody would do who's confident God was for you too. It all comes back to perspective. It all comes back to recognizing that when things are bad, God's not absent. And when things are good, well, you're not God. You see, Joseph never stopped believing that God was with him through the bad, but the bigger lesson was when Joseph realized he needed to stop playing God when things were good, when he had the power. When Joseph saw the bigger picture, he made the choice to love his brothers. So if you are in a place right now where you've got the upper hand, here's what I know. It's a lot harder to trust God and do the right thing. It's a lot easier to assume you have it all under control. It's tough not to use your power to get back at people who once hurt you and now they need you. But do you know what people with power like you, do you know what they do when they're confident God is with them? They forgive. They do not play God. They leave the vindication to God and they forgive. And then they give. They don't assume the powers for their benefit. They don't assume everything they have is for their own consumption. They choose generosity even towards those who have hurt them because they have decided to hold everything with an open hand. Now, I know both of those things are difficult, but here's what I also know. You will never experience all the good that can come from the bad you've gone through until you are first willing to acknowledge God was with you in the bad and until you refuse to play God when things are good. So let me ask you one more time. What would you do if you were confident God was with you? The good news is He is. And you can be certain of that because your Savior hung on a Roman cross to prove it to you. So will you trust Him? Will you do the next right thing? And when you have the power in your hands, will you forgive and will you give even when it's hard? That is a choice that you'll never forget.